Fluid under high pressure doesn't just leak. It hisses, cutting an invisible line through the dirt before the pedal goes, completely soft beneath your foot. Julian cut the steel-braided lines of my vintage Porsche just to ensure my inheritance reverted to him before my 25th birthday. I died trapped in a spinning cage of aluminum and shattered glass, screaming his name. Then I woke up 3 days before the crash, sitting in the garage with a pair of heavy industrial shears in my lap. The first thing that hit me was the sharp, metallic tang of 10W30 motor oil and the damp, heavy smell of cured concrete. My lungs expanded so fast it physically ached. I wasn't tasting blood. I wasn't choking on the white dust of a deployed airbag. I looked down at my hands. They were smooth. The jagged lacerations that had severed my tendons in my final moments were completely gone. I dropped the heavy shears. They hit the epoxy-coated floor of the garage with a loud, ringing clatter. The date on the digital wall clock glowed in a harsh red font. September 18th. I was 24. I was exactly 72 hours away from my 25th birthday, the day the $35 million trust fund left by my late father would legally transfer into my sole possession. In my first life, I hadn't made it to that birthday. In my first life, Julian had suggested a romantic sunset drive up the winding cliffside roads of Devil's Peak to celebrate. He had insisted I take my newly restored 1978 Porsche 911. He had kissed my forehead, told me he would follow closely behind in his Aston Martin, and watched with dead eyes as my car plummeted 300 feet into the rocky ravine. "Clara, are you even listening to me?" The voice sent a wave of nausea so severe, I had to grip the cold steering wheel of the Porsche to remain standing. I slowly turned my head. Julian was standing in the doorway connecting the house to the garage. He looked exactly as he had in my nightmares. The impeccably tailored navy suit, the perfectly styled hair, the faint, suffocating scent of his signature citrus and cedar cologne. He was holding 2 crystal tumblers of scotch. In my first life, I had run to him, eager for his attention, desperate to prove I was worthy of his polished old money facade. I asked if you were packed for the cabin. Julian sighed, his voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing exhaustion. He stepped into the garage, his expensive leather Oxfords clicking against the concrete. "You've been obsessing over this car all morning. You need to relax, Clara. The trust transfer is making you paranoid." I looked at him. I searched my chest for the desperate, pathetic love that had defined my entire early 20s. There was nothing, just a cold echoing void. "I'm perfectly fine, Julian," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. It was entirely flat, monotone, devoid of the anxious, high-pitched tremor I used to carry. Julian blinked, stopping a few feet away from me. He wasn't used to me responding without an apology. I was the reliable one, the naive heiress who craved his validation. "Right," he muttered, thrown slightly off balance. He offered me one of the tumblers. "Well, drink up. We leave for Devil's Peak tomorrow evening. I want us to take both cars. You should get the Porsche out on those mountain curves before your birthday." Really open the throttle. There it was. The exact script from the timeline that had murdered me. "That sounds perfect," I replied smoothly. I didn't take the glass. I just kept my eyes locked on his perfectly symmetrical, lying face. "I'll be ready." Julian frowned, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his features at my lack of enthusiasm, but he didn't push it. He set the tumbler on a workbench and turned back toward the house. "I have a board meeting. Don't wait up." I waited until the heavy fire door clicked shut behind him. I listened to the muffled sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. Only then did I exhale. I walked over to the front driver's side wheel of my Porsche. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the dirt, and slid underneath the chassis. I pulled a high-lumen flashlight from my back pocket and clicked it on. The harsh white beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the wheel well. I traced the path of the hydraulic brake line. It looked flawless from a distance. But when I ran my fingers over the reinforced steel braiding just above the caliper, I felt it. A microscopic surgical slice. It hadn't severed the line completely. That would leave a puddle on the garage. Floor and trigger the dashboard warning. Light instantly. It was a depth-calculated cut. The line would hold pressure for normal city driving. But the moment I hit the steep, high-speed descent of Devil's Peak and slammed on the brakes, the pressure would spike, the line would violently burst, and the pedal would go straight to the floorboard. It was an exquisite, brilliant murder. I slid out from under the car. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The woman who would have wept over his betrayal had died in a canyon. I walked over to the heavy steel tool chest. I pulled out a hydraulic jack, a set of line wrenches, and a bleeder kit. The next 6 hours were a masterclass in quiet, calculated execution. I didn't just replace the compromised brake line on my Porsche with a fresh steel-braided hose. That would be too easy. That would leave Julian alive to try again. Instead, I carefully extracted the rigged, damaged line. I held the sabotage in my hands. Then, I walked over to the other side of the expansive garage, where Julian's prized, custom-ordered Aston Martin Vantage was parked. I jacked up his car. I removed his front left wheel. I unthreaded his pristine, factory-grade brake line. And I flawlessly installed the rigged, compromised line in its place. I topped off the fluid. I bled the air from the system with absolute mechanical precision. I wiped down the fittings, so there wasn't a single fingerprint or drop of moisture left behind. When I lowered the Aston Martin back to the ground, my hands were covered in black grease, but my heart was beating a steady, beautiful, unbothered rhythm against my ribs. The following evening arrived with a heavy, oppressive overcast sky. The air felt thick, charged with the impending pressure of a storm. We stood in the driveway. Julian was adjusting his expensive sunglasses, grinning at me across the asphalt. "You take the lead, Clara," he called out, his voice practically vibrating with concealed anticipation. "I'll be right behind you. Don't be afraid to push it on the straightaways." "I won't be," I said. I climbed into the low bucket seat of the Porsche. I turned the ignition. The air-cooled flat-six engine roared to life, a deep, aggressive mechanical growl that vibrated straight through my spine. I gripped the leather steering wheel. My hands were perfectly steady. The drive up Highway 9 to Devil's Peak was 30 miles of treacherous, ascending asphalt. It was a road designed to punish the careless. Sharp switchbacks, blind corners, and a sheer, unprotected drop-off into the rocky canyon below. I led the way, driving with a clinical, detached precision. In my rearview mirror, Julian's silver Aston Martin was a constant, predatory shadow. He stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind me. He was waiting. He was waiting for the final, brutal descent where the road plunged into a series of 7 back-to-back hairpin turns known as the Serpent. We crested the summit. The descent began. I downshifted, letting the engine braking do the heavy lifting. But I kept my speed deceptively high. I needed him to push his own car. I needed him to build the hydraulic pressure. In the mirror, I saw the nose of the Aston Martin dip heavily as Julian rode. His brakes into the first turn, they held. We carved through the second turn. He stayed tight on my bumper. Then came the third turn. The steepest drop. The hairpin angle. I watched the mirror. I saw the exact moment the trap snapped shut on his own throat. Julian's brake lights flared a brilliant, blinding crimson as he approached the corner at 80 miles an hour. But the nose of his car didn't dip. The speed didn't drop. Through my open window, I heard it. A sharp, violent hiss followed by the sickening, desperate sound of rubber tires locking up in a futile attempt to find traction. The compromised brake line had burst under the immense pressure. His pedal had just gone straight to the floor. I didn't swerve. I didn't hit the brakes. I cleanly navigated the apex of the turn and pulled onto a small gravel shoulder, bringing the Porsche to a smooth, controlled stop. I put the car in park. I turned in my seat and watched through the rear windshield. Julian's silver Aston Martin shot past the curve like a bullet. There was a fraction of a second where the car seemed to hang suspended in the gray, heavy air. I saw his face through the driver's side window. The arrogant, spoiled certainty had completely evaporated, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at my parked car. He realized in that final, agonizing microsecond that I wasn't the prey. Then the car vanished over the edge of the cliff. The sound it made wasn't a cinematic explosion. It was a wet, heavy, catastrophic crunch. The sound of 2 tons of luxury engineering being pulverized against solid granite. The echo bounced off the canyon walls. A violent shockwave that rattled the loose gravel around my tires. Then absolute total silence. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't scream for help. I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened my door, and stepped out into the crisp mountain air. I walked slowly to the edge of the unbarricaded cliff. I looked down. The Aston Martin was a crumpled, smoking heap of twisted silver metal 300 feet below. A thin trail of black smoke curled into the overcast sky. It smelled of premium leather, burnt synthetic rubber, and spilled engine coolant. I stood at the edge of the abyss, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my jacket. I felt a profound, beautiful emptiness in my chest. There was no grief. There was no trauma. Just the quiet, undisputed reality of survival. He had spent 6 months meticulously planning a tragedy. I just ensured the right person attended the funeral. I turned my back on the wreckage. I walked back to my perfectly intact, beautifully running vintage Porsche. Tomorrow was my 25th birthday. The money was mine. My life was mine. And the man who tried to take it from me was exactly where he belonged. If Clara's cold, calculated reversal gave you chills, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is letting toxic people fall into their own traps. Subscribe for more dark, relentless karma stories every single week. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done with the break lines?